They say you should never meet your heroes, because up close, the myth fades and the magic wears off. But in 1824, when an aging Marquis de Lafayette returned to the United States, the last living general of the American Revolution, he somehow lived up to the legend. But Lafayette wasn't just a ghost of 1776. He was still the revolutionary at heart. Today, we revisit that triumphal tour of a French hero in a young republic and ask, how did Lafayette pull off the impossible, being as good as the stories said he was? Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus and joined, as always, with my well-read co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins.
Hey everyone, today is going to be a really good episode. We have with us Elizabeth Reese. She is a historian, but also the senior manager of public programs and interpretation at the Woodlawn Pope Leahy House. And even more importantly, she is the author of the book Marquis de Lafayette Returns, a tour of America's national capital region. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited.
So before we get into the questions, I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you, without looking, say his full name?
Marie-Joseph Paul-Israel Chibert de Mortier, the Marquis de Lafayette.
Okay.
Wow.
So, for anyone listening,
I can't.
You know she's legit. He has a silly name, like a silly long name. It is absurd.
The silliest name. That was. It's always fun to pull that out of. That was, I think, the first thing I learned about him was I memorized his name because I was like, this seems like a helpful fact to have.
Okay, yeah, because we didn't prep that question, and I was not confident that you would know offhand.
I'm just impressed. I've never learned it. I mean, I know when I hear it, I know it's correct, but I couldn't come up with it on my own.
It has a nice rhythm. I think that's the only, it has kind of like an iambic pentameter-ness to it. I think that's the only reason I've memorized it.
So for the listeners who may not be familiar with it, although we've done an episode on Lafayette before, but more generally, but those who may not be familiar with who he is, how would you describe him in, just a brief overview?
I say Lafayette is a French noble who is really inspired by the American cause for independence for a multitude of reasons. For the one being the fact he's a teenager during the Enlightenment. And so this period of human expression and liberty and self-government really speaks to his generation. And he comes to the United States and he volunteers his services, quite literally volunteers his services to the Continental Army. He knocks on the door of Continental Congress and they're like, who are you? And they shut the door in his face. And he becomes, through this kind of he was a very smart, very, very determined man and proves himself on the battlefield and becomes very close with George Washington. So he's this very unique figure in American history because he's not American. He is French. He is a very wealthy Frenchman. And he is one of the many forces of why we won the revolution, especially during the siege of Yorktown, and was one of the many people who was helpful in getting French aid, which is why we won Yorktown and ended the war, is thanks to the French. So he's this French soldier, he's a statesman, and then he comes back to the United States in 1824. It's the first time he's been back in 40 years. And America throws a big old party for him that lasts for 13 months.
13 months.
Yeah, it was supposed to be 4 months. So in 1784, Lafayette comes back to America. That was his first time back after the American Revolution was over. The war ends pretty much right after Yorktown. He's going back to France. And then he comes back a couple years later. And really the objective of that visit was that he was going to be able to spend time with George Washington and the Washington family. He spends about 2 weeks at Mount Vernon, and but 4 months in the United States. It's pretty much just along the East Coast. He's really along the Mid-Atlantic for the most part. And so when he comes back 40 years later, that tour was supposed to replicate the tour that happened 40 years before, this very short 4-month tour. But what happened is that other states and cities found out that he was around, and they asked him to come. They sent him invitations. And so this itinerary gets longer and longer and longer until he traveled to all 24 states at the time. I think it's a distance of over 6,000 miles over 13 months, meeting millions and millions of people. And to the point that in a lot of these places that are now retracing it, because at the time we are recording this, we are middling end of celebrating the bicentennial of Lafayette's visit. He was here from August of 1824 to September of 1825. And so we're right in the thick of this bicentennial. A lot of these small towns, that is still one of like the biggest things that's ever happened. And so celebrating Lafayette is still a very big deal in many, many places.
I love his story of how he ended up in the revolution. And if you could talk a little bit about, so I think he was 16 when he was married. Is that, and his wife to be was 14, or maybe he was 18 or 6. It was young. Whatever
Yes.
it was young. And it seems like nobody wanted him to, run off to war because he's supposed to be a noble. He has money, but he decides I'm going to go fight a war and forget all this, my family and everything I have to do here in France. And he heads on over, and then he sort of attaches himself to George Washington. So I'm interested in what was going on, right before he left, and then also how his relationship with George Washington is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think definitely his relationship to George Washington is one of the reasons why we kind of like know the name Lafayette for certain. But kind of what brings him to America in the first place, I say it's like twofold. One, there's an element of revenge, and two, there is this element of, again, being this child of the Enlightenment and like wanting the sense of patriotism and liberty and like fighting for the common good. The revenge part is because when Lafayette is 2 years old, his father, who is the Marquis de Lafayette, Lafayette inherits his title. He was killed during the Battle of Minden during the 7 Years' War. And he was killed by, it's not Cornwallis, but it's like someone around, like there's this, it's the whole thing, 18th century. Everyone knows everyone and everyone's connected to everyone. A man who is serving with Cornwallis under Cornwallis. Cornwallis is also there at this battle as well. And his father is killed. And so it's brings him up with this kind of lifelong hatred of the British. I lovingly joke that I think also him being French has something to do with an innate hatred of the British as well. So that's kind of something that's like happening in his kind of childhood and kind of what he's growing up with. His mother passes away when he is 12 years old. So Lafayette is an orphan. He is an orphan that is one of the richest men in the country. And while he had a lot of money, he didn't have a lot of status. His family was from Chavignac. It's a southern part of France. It's actually kind of similar to like the American Southeast in terms of like what he would have experienced, like what he would have seen, kind of away from it all in a way. Mm-hmm. It's not close to Paris. He did not become formally introduced to Paris until he was a little, like he's preteen is when he is kind of gets his formal introduction to French society. And to kind of put in perspective of how far out of French and Parisian court like he really was, is when he arrived to Paris, he was so surprised that people did not doff their caps at the sight of him because he was from an area where his family completely controlled and they knew who he was. So he was a little bit surprised at that. It becomes very quickly apparent that this is a young man with a lot of money and he needs to have an eligible match. So he gets married at the age of 16. His wife is 14. It's an arranged marriage. So like it's predetermined when they are literally children that they are going to get married. Mm-hmm. They don't know that at the time, but it becomes apparent later. And he marries into the Noailles family, which he could not have married up any higher unless he married into the French royal family. The Noailles were so influential in the French court. If you're familiar with Marie Antoinette, there's like the woman who taught Marie Antoinette how to be French when she came from Austria was Lafayette's wife's Adrienne. It was her aunt. So that's
Oh,
kind of the
wow.
Okay.
world in which he enters into. It's a world he does not very comfortable in. He's from the country.
Yeah.
He's used to kind of doing what he wants, and French court is so strict. So this is all happening around the same time as he's hearing about what's going on during in the colonies, and it's like, hey, maybe I can be have a little bit more fun over there than kind of being at Versailles all day, and makes a plan that is. It's said that he snuck away in the middle of the night and stole a ship. The way that I think it kind of happened is like King Louis XVI was like, I'm just going to look the other way, and you do what you kind of have to do.
Right.
But it is very nice, like dramatic story to be like he left his whole family, and there's a like a story that he like wore women's clothing to disguise his appearance, and like that kind of dramatics. But it's still very dramatic. I mean, when he comes to America, he's 19 years old. He doesn't speak any English. He uses the journey across the Atlantic to learn English, and so it is a whole new world. When he gets here, he goes straight to, he lands in Georgetown, South Carolina, and then makes his way up north to Philadelphia to meet with the Continental Congress, and then he meets George Washington. And really, that is kind of the thing that really changes the tides for him. What he finds in Washington is the father he was searching for his whole life, and for the rest of his life he views George Washington as the man to emulate above all else. It's kind of interesting that like their kind of interaction, like they have a very kind of like formal meeting. Washington has met a lot of other French nobles, because Lafayette's not the only one. There's a ton of his countrymen who are just coming here for a title and payment, and like that's it.
Okay.
But Lafayette is a little different. He says like, I am here to learn, not teach. And so he has this kind of humility and this humbleness to him that I think shocks Washington. And Washington invites him to join his family, which is a very common term used in the American military as joining his military family. And Lafayette, who again, he has just learned English on the couple month journey over here, he misinterprets this as the word famille, which is a French word meaning your intimate members of the blood. So essentially, Lafayette gets here and he's like, this amazing man is adopting me. This is the best like thing that could have ever happened. It's a kind of a mistranslation communication that happens, but it ends up being that's exactly what kind of Washington was offering in the end, even if he didn't intend that when he was saying that, because Lafayette really does become someone that Washington views as a son. And for Washington, who did not have biological children of his own with Martha, it's an even like greater bond that these two men have.
Now, Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong. Washington didn't know French, right?
Not that I'm aware of. No.
How? I don't. This is a complete aside and a total tangent, but I'm like befuddled that people back then were like picked up languages so like easily. Like they didn't have Duolingo, they didn't have any of this stuff, and somehow
they also weren't scrolling the internet for 10 hours a day. They didn't have TV. I mean, what else do you have to do? Like their brains.
I guess
we don't have the patience anymore.
I guess
our brains have been rewired.
They're like, oh, casually, if you want to do any sort of international business, you must learn French. I'm like, and they just sort of like have a usable amount of French, like just almost everyone is kind of just walking around with it for some reason. I'm just always
Washington doesn't. And Washington doesn't, which I also think is it's a little bit of it. Washington has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder in terms of like he doesn't have the formal education that
because he didn't go to school, right?
Yeah, like all of his peers have, and that includes languages, and so it's interesting. I think there's something in, even though like you wouldn't necessarily expect Washington, who is still like he's incredibly like privileged, he's a part of like this elite planter class, but he does not have that education, sees something in Lafayette, who's this like as rich as a person could possibly be in the 18th century, and has all this like formal education and schooling. There's something that they see at each other that is like Washington could not really speak French. Lafayette was still learning English. And so like there's kind of, I can't think of the word. Like it's not like an intimacy, but like it's a vulnerability that I think they have with each other.
Lafayette come from a family that was, because his father was a soldier. Were they typically officers in the military? Is that sort of why? Like, how would he have any experience or understand what's going on at 19 years old? Obviously, he hasn't been soldiering his whole life.
Yeah,
he did have like some like soldiering school, so to speak, in his younger days. But his father was in the military, and that he is proudly descended from people who fought alongside Joan of Arc. So that kind of elite family has a history of military service.
Gotcha. Okay, so he would have had some level of understanding of like what his job would supposed to be.
He's not like totally completely like dropped in the middle of a foreign country and like figured it out. There was at least some sense of what he was kind of expecting to do, I think, when he first arrived here.
Okay.
And I imagine it would be a way for him to make a name for himself where he actually did something versus was just born into it. I don't know if that played a role at all. But I can see at that age.
Yeah, exactly. At that age, and again, with the Enlightenment, like this idea of like proving the honor that you have, and it's not something that's kind of like plopped upon you. I think the fact that Lafayette didn't really like Versailles says a lot to that it's like, I want to do something with this. When he comes and during the revolution, he serves without pay, and he funds the war with $200,000 of, and that's 1780s money, of his own money, which is then given as a repayment to him when he comes back in 1824 by Congress.
Oh, they actually paid a debt? My goodness.
Yeah, no interest though. It was a flat $200,000. But they did throw in a land grant near present-day Tallahassee, Florida, which Lafayette did not move. He didn't move to Florida. He did eventually sell off that land, but it was offered to him.
Oh,
that's something, right?
Yeah.
I guess.
Never been to Tallahassee, but
there's a whole neighborhood near there that is a bunch of French names and named after Lafayette because of him. So
there's a lot of places named after Lafayette. Shockingly,
yeah.
I think it goes to show you what you were saying before we started. You were talking about how people are excited about this bicentennial.
Yeah,
right.
I think when I first started really digging into this project, one of the things that drew me about Lafayette, he's always kind of been this, I call him like, he's like been haunting me from like historic site to historic site that I've ever worked at. He's been around. And so he's been this kind of like through line of working at Hamilton Grange National Memorial, and then working at the United States Capitol building where I was for 5 years. I talked about him a lot. I was working there during like the height of the Hamilton musical. So he was a name that people knew. He is in so many different rooms. The painting of the surrender at Yorktown, he's in that painting. The rotunda itself was completed in time for his tour. So really easy way for me to win over 8th grade groups at that time. I don't know if it would still work today, was to say that you're standing on the same floor that Lafayette stood on. This is the same sandstone. And then there's a portrait of him that's in the House chamber. There's only 2 portraits in that room, and one is George Washington and the other is Lafayette. And the one of Lafayette was given as a gift by the artist Ari Scheffer to Congress as during his tour. And it actually sat in the rotunda for the majority of his tour. So he was a name that even before the Hamilton musical came out, that people were like, oh, I went to Lafayette High School. I grew up on a Lafayette street. And so many of these namesakes actually came out from this tour. It was Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania was named after him because the founders of the school saw him from raced back to Easton and were like, we got to name the school after this guy. Lafayette never stepped foot on campus, but they're like, we're going to name the school after him. There's a spike in even baby names of children being named Lafayette or Fayette, even girls with the middle name of Lafayette or Fayette.
Because they didn't want to name Marie Joseph, blah, 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 Lafayette.
the full name's a little long. And I guess it's funny because his first name is Gilbert. It's Gilbert.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Right.
I
But we just call him Lafayette.
Gilbert. I forgot the Gilbert.
Which I love, just the reminder that his name's Gilbert.
By the time it's 1824, is this kind of like the mystique? Is it because it's him, or is it because he's one of the surviving members of the generation of 76?
Right.
Like,
Both.
is it both of those things? Like, because there was a big, like, because they were all dying off at this point, and he would have been one of the last ones left.
It's something I equate to, like, right now. I think that we, like the World War II generation, how there are so few left. And so the stories that people are telling, and for now we call it oral history, but like preserving those stories from people who were alive becomes this kind of pressing moment of importance. And that was exactly what was happening in 1824. It was just for the revolution. And because Lafayette was 19 when he became a major general, he is the last surviving major general of the revolution when he comes back. So that is a huge, huge part of it. And then the other part is that he is so deeply loved, and he is loved outside of partisan politics, which is very unusual in this time period. Lafayette tried to come back to America a couple times during the French Revolution. One time he tries to come back, he's captured en route, and he is imprisoned for 5 years between Prussia and Austria, and most of the time is in a prison called Olmütz, which is still a prison today. He is released from prison, and then he tries to come back to the United States because this is also when the quasi-war with France is starting to happen, which I explain to people who maybe are unfamiliar. It's more like a Cold War than anything else, but it's having major tensions between these two countries, which as of like a couple of years ago were allies. And so he's encouraged not to come, and he writes this letter to Alexander Hamilton being like, hey, can I come stay with you, essentially? And Hamilton writes this nasty letter being like, I have never once believed that France could become a republic, and I have believed that, like, the objective, while it continues, can only produce misfortunes. I give you this assurance on the faith of our former friendship. It is a mean letter.
I didn't hear that in the musical. Sorry.
I know, it's
that
part skipped out. But he closes it with this sentiment that is so interesting. And he says that the only thing in which our parties agree is to love you. And I don't necessarily think that he was even thinking of what he thought of everything that he said, but like, I don't think he was thinking 40 years, 200 years in the future by what that meant, because if Lafayette did come to America in the 1790s, he would have had to pick a political party. He would have had to be a Federalist. He would have had to be a Democratic Republican. And he had friends on both sides of the aisle and was genuinely and deeply friends with Hamilton as he was with Jefferson. And I'm pretty sure he is the only person on earth who could genuinely say that he was good friends with both of them.
I was going to say he should have written Jefferson. Jefferson would have been like, come on over, buddy.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Jefferson tried to get him to become governor of the Louisiana Territory. And then at that time, Lafayette said, nah, I don't want to. But so when he comes back 40 years later, he doesn't belong to a political party. He belongs to the American people. And that lasted in 1824, and I think it still is today. Like, because when he came back in 1824, the feelings that Americans have for him is this neutral feeling of inspiration. And I haven't seen that with many historical figures that are as known as he is of this time period. I think he stands alone in that.
It's very Washingtonian.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Could you give us so for those of us who don't know a lot about 1824, as far as what was going on politically, what was going on with, you don't
have to call
James
me out like
Monroe.
that, Lynn.
I know. I said us, as in like the university. So what was going on in 1824, and did someone invite Lafayette, or did he just decide he needed a vacation? I mean, I know it was what was the bicentennial, right? The 1820. I don't know. What was the? Look at me. I'm just why did he come when he did, and not earlier or later? When did he die? He only died like what, in like 26? Didn't he die not long after?
1834. Yeah. So like
1834. Okay.
Yeah, 10 years after. It's all jumbles together.
All the years.
I always tell people, I'm like, I'm not generally great with dates. I'm great with chronological timelines, but in terms of like actual dates, sometimes I have to look things up. So that's okay.
Unfortunate because that's the first thing anyone ever hears. If you're like, I do things in the history space, I can't even imagine if you're an actual historian. Even just for me, they're like, oh, what's Washington's birthday? I'm like, it is the least significant thing.
Right.
I don't have it off the top of my head.
Right.
1730 something? I don't know.
Google it.
Yeah.
He didn't do anything for like at least 20 years.
Exactly. I always tell people when we have interpreters at the museum that I work and they get like, if they're really worried about dates, I'm just like, if you know when something happened and like why it happened and the general time frame of which it happened, that's okay. And if like people are really going to press you on it, you can just look it up. It's all right. Like memorizing dates gets you kind of caught into a spiral, and it's just
exactly.
It's okay.
Sure. So to get back to Lynn's question,
so 1824.
What's
1824?
Set the scene.
A lot is happening. So we have to backtrack a little bit. The country's under the presidency of James Monroe, and after the War of 1812, something pretty unique happens, in that it's one of the first times Americans start identifying themselves as Americans. This collective word is starting to be used. And prior to this, you would have been a New Yorker, a Virginian, a Pennsylvanian, so on and so forth. But this collective idea of Americans starts to come out of the war. And does everyone agree on what it means to be an American? No. Much like today, people don't agree on that term. It's the same thing 200 plus years ago. But Monroe really likes this sense of unity that's coming out of the war. He really wants to continue it. And he views political parties, well, that's the source of division. So instead of kind of addressing it, he's like, I'm just going to ignore that political parties exist. And what tends to happen is if you have a wound and you try to forget about it, it's going to fester, it's going to grow. And so that is what's happening under Monroe's administration, where these political divisions that he wanted to avoid are getting way worse. The country's also on the cusp of celebrating its 50th birthday. That's going to be happening in 1826. And with all of this kind of political infighting, nobody's really wants to put on a party hat and have fun. Patriotism and kind of this was waning. So he looks across the Atlantic and he's like, well, Lafayette is still alive. Lafayette is the last surviving general of the Revolution, which we are about to celebrate. He is almost universally beloved. Why don't we see if he wants to come? So in February of 1824, he writes a formal invitation for Lafayette to visit. Lafayette at this time period, it's interesting, in France, he is nowhere near as beloved as he is here in America. And that's certainly the case that's happening in the 1820s. He is really, really passionate about equality and civil rights. And he also, and Napoleon don't get along. So he's, at this point in his life, looking for a change of pace. During the French Revolution, all of his money and his titles and land holdings were stripped. So he's also in need of kind of income and it's cash. It's okay to leave. He's like, finally I can go back to America, and this is probably a good time to do so. So he agrees. Monroe says that he would send a ship. Lafayette says no, he does not want this to be seen as kind of a political visit. He wants this to be the kind of a personal trip. So he pays for his own way, and he also brings his son, whose name is George Washington Lafayette, and his personal secretary, whose name is Auguste Levasseur, who's not as a fun name, but fun French name, who comes with him. And so they travel together, and Levasseur actually writes a journal of his entire travels with Lafayette on the tour. So we have a really nice kind of firsthand account. And that journal was written to send back to France to be like, kind of like PR, I guess, in a way. So Lafayette arrives on the eve of the 50th birthday, and with the hopes of kind of stirring this patriotic fervor, and he absolutely does. When he first arrives in America, he lands in New York on Staten Island on August 15th. And then the next day he sails across New York Harbor, and he has this massive reception at Castle Clinton, which is the southernmost tip of the island of Manhattan. And waiting for him are 50,000 people. The population of New York City at the time is about 150,000.
Whoa.
So a third of the entire city just at the southern tip of Castle Clinton, just the hopes of seeing him. And that's going to replay for the next 13 months of Lafayette's life.
Huh.
Wow.
Yeah, that's now, is that when they renamed the street in is it in Soho, I guess? Lafayette Street? Is that when that all happened? Or was that
That's a good
in response
question.
to this?
It might. I have to double check the grid system and see like when that actually happened, because there's some that are a little earlier. I know like Lafayette Street I live in Alexandria, and that was named in 1784 after his like mini tour. So, but for the most part,
Gotcha.
it's around the tour itself.
Okay, yeah. 'Cause the only reason I'm familiar that there is that, well, I lived in New York for a while, but I went to NYU and there was a dorm on the street, and it was called Lafayette. Like that was
Nice.
the name of the dormitory. If anyone is listening to this and lives in that dormitory, comment below. There's zero chance that we have any college age students listening to this. Maybe.
You never know.
You never know. So he tours around New York, and is there anything in particular? Oh, actually, were Monroe and him friends from this entire time? Because Monroe both was in the army and then spent some time in France, like during the French Revolution.
Yeah. Lafayette and Monroe have a very interesting connection in that Monroe, and especially Monroe's wife, Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, were instrumental in getting Lafayette's wife out of prison. So while Lafayette was imprisoned in Austria, his family was imprisoned in France. And Lafayette's wife, who was a member of this French noble family, her mother, her sister, and her grandmother were all executed by the guillotine. And the day before his wife Adrienne was scheduled for her execution, her life was spared. What Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe would do is go to visit Adrienne every day in this American, like very fancy carriage, be making it known to like the officials that the Americans are watching and paying attention to see what happens to Adrienne and Lafayette's wife. And so they were able to negotiate her release. As soon as she's released, the first thing she does is goes to find out where her husband is, finds out that he's imprisoned in Austria. She goes to Austria, tries to see if he can be released. They say, of course not. And she goes, okay, fine. I am going to be willingly imprisoned with him, and I'm going to bring my 2 daughters with us. And they've already sent their son across the Atlantic. And he actually goes and lives with the Washington family because the male heir had a little bit of a higher target on his back than the women. So for 2 years, the family is imprisoned in Olmütz together. And it's largely because of her actions and the fact that her life was saved by the Monroes that he was able to survive prison as well. So a kind of a very deep emotional bond that these 2 men have.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
And what happened to his wife? I know she was no longer living in 1824. How long did she live after?
Is this the same wife as the 14-year-old? Is this the same person?
Yes, it's the same one. He only had one wife. He might have had a couple mistresses, but he only had one wife. She, unfortunately, her time in prison with Lafayette did a horrible number on her health. And so she never really recovers from that. And she passes away in 1807. So she is no longer alive when Lafayette comes back in 1824. After they're released from prison, he really takes a step back from politics to like care for her. And then it's not until after her death, it's not really until 1808 that Lafayette kind of resumes that public life, which then he continues for the rest of his life.
Right.
I'm just out of pure curiosity, because I don't think we've talked about it with anyone, Lynn. He obviously didn't expect to be imprisoned when the revolution started, I'm assuming. What was his perspective on this whole thing going, like basically in retrospect, like, when he messages Hamilton, or like in messages, acting like he had a phone, when he texted Hamilton, he slid into Hamilton's DMs. I was like, hey man, can I crash? And he said, no. What was Lafayette's feeling about how the revolution was going, how it progressed, and even like in retrospect, how it played out? I
think it's interesting. I think the most interesting thing about Lafayette and the French Revolution is that in terms of with France, he was a constitutional monarchist. He believed that for France, the best option was to have a more representative government, quite similar to British Parliament, which I think is very ironic. He just volunteered his services for a nation that was not his by birth, to break away from a monarchy. But for France, he felt like that was the best case. And that is a very unpopular opinion to have, especially as the terror is starting to escalate. So that's at the point where he realizes this is probably not going to go well for me. But for as long as he can, he tries to kind of remain that middle kind of ground. There's a very famous moment at Versailles during the it's like the Women's March to Versailles, and there's like a mob coming for Marie Antoinette, and he rides ahead of them and goes and takes her out on the balcony and kisses her hand, and then it helps to like quell the mob. So he's trying to placate both sides, but he is also still a member of the noble class. And the French Revolution is a revolution against the royals and the nobles and then the common people. So that kind of puts a target on his back. One of the outcomes of the revolution is the rise of Napoleon, and Lafayette hated Napoleon. So he doesn't Napoleon helps get Lafayette out of prison, and I always say like that's the beginning and the end of any kind of cordial relationship that these two men have. So
interesting, yeah, because he is, and I think you're right that he is more famous here than he is in France. I've talked with someone about this, and like there's an American flag at his grave. Like it's not a French flag, like it's not a big place. It's like a small little thing, but he feels like a huge figure to us.
Yes. Yeah. And he is. And I think that there is something about his selfless service, like the act of giving yourself to donate, like giving your time and your blood for this common cause of liberty and equality.
I find it fascinating that his reputation and that has persisted until now, because he isn't, like he isn't involved in American politics outside of just that one moment.
Yeah.
And that's all that ended up mattering.
Yeah, I think the tour did a lot for why he is so just universally beloved. I think for starters, there was an element of youth that was in the tour, like coming out to seeing him. For many people, for many young people, this may be the only like major veteran of the revolution that they would have ever maybe seen in the flesh, and that made a huge impact on them. There's also a production of souvenirs that is really unlike anything of like a historical event of this time period, and because the souvenirs were not limited to gender, age, or any sort of demographic. It was like there was something for everyone. Most common were badges, which like ribbons with Lafayette's face on them that newspapers would advertise in the days before his arrival so that people could buy them, and you could have your Lafayette merch. You could buy Lafayette smoking pipes with his face on it. You could get gloves. There's a hilarious account, I think it's in Philadelphia, and a young woman presents her hand to him, and she's wearing a glove with his face on it, and he basically says that he will not kiss his own face, which is very funny. But there's this like kind of merchandise frenzy. It is not beyond me that there have been a couple people who have compared this to Taylor Swift's Eras tour, of this kind of collective moment that's happening that is like seared into people's memory.
Yeah.
They were beating bracelets.
Yes.
They were singing all the songs.
They were having watch parties on TikTok every night of where Lafayette was. It's a cultural event.
Oh yeah. Celebrity, yeah.
And it's one of the first documented cases of tourism in American history, where we have like documented evidence of people traveling outside of their homes. And we see it a lot in smaller cities when the recorded number of people who came out to see Lafayette outnumbers the recorded population at the time. And for this time period where people really don't travel outside of their county, people are traveling with just the hopes of seeing him. Like, in the winter of 1824, 1825, he really uses Washington, D.C. as his home base. And at that time, taverns and boarding houses see maximum capacity at an otherwise really quiet time in the city, because people know Lafayette is staying in Washington. If I go to Washington, I might see him at the theater. I might see him at the street. I might see him at Congress. I might see him at something. And that just, it does not happen in this time period for people to travel. Because you think about like the form of transportation, it's walking, it's horseback, it's coach, it's carriage. And if you've got water, you've got this brand new invention called the steamboat. But that's pretty much it.
Huh. Yeah, so I live out in LA, and it does remind me a little bit of like, when like Star Tours or something like that. Like someone gets a star on the Walk of Fame, like people show up, like they'll fly out here if they're real big fans, just to see.
Yeah,
that's a fascinating human impulse that apparently stands the test of time.
It's I think just as American as apple pie and baseball is celebrity culture.
And speaking of, I guess, celebrities, he saw a lot of famous people, or he visited a lot of famous people. If you could tell us a few of them, but my favorite is, because of course Washington has long passed, but he visits some of his his grandchildren or his step grandchildren.
Yes.
And yeah, so I mean, he's going to see everybody when he's there.
Yeah, he kind of really recognizes that this is going to be his last time coming to America. So he really wants to make the most of it. And he goes and visits people that he had served with. If there's any like higher ranking people, he visits the Adamses. He visits Jefferson multiple times. He visits Monroe. He visits Madison. And then anyone he kind of knew, it was an opportunity to visit them. But I'm with you, Lynn. His connection to the Custuses, who were George Washington's step grandchildren. So to make things less confusing, Martha Washington was married prior to her marriage to George. She had 2 children with her first husband, or 2 children that survived infancy. And then her son had 4 children. And so these 4 children are kind of, while they're not biologically Washington's heirs, they are socially seen as his heirs. And Cassie Good has a wonderful book about them called First Family, which I highly recommend if anyone wants to know more about the Custuses. And
if you don't want to read the book, you can go listen to our interview with Cassie Good about that particular book.
Highly recommend. And they all live in the DC area. So they are all nearby. Lafayette goes and visits Wash Custis at Arlington House. He goes and visits Patty Peter at her home Tudor Place. He visits Nellie Custis at Woodlawn, where I work. And Eliza, the oldest, is kind of bopping around, living in a bunch of different places. But she's also included in this too. And so really any spare moment he has when he's in the DC area, he's spending time with them. And it's a way of kind of reflecting on that connection with Washington, because Washington died in 1799. He's not here. But Lafayette he goes to Mount Vernon quite a few times. He goes and is able to actually like pay his respects to Washington at the tomb, which is like kind of a closure when you think that he wasn't able to mourn in America. And it has been almost 25 years since he found out that Washington had died. So that was a particularly emotional moment that happens pretty early on in the tour. And then after that's happened and it's reported in newspapers, there's a ton of like Lafayette and Washington imagery that's sold as merchandise and also used as kind of like public art, I guess is a way of saying it. Cities would build physical archways and banners for when Lafayette would arrive, and there would be a lot of like Washington and Lafayette connections through that too.
Was his son friends with the Custis? I would assume, because they would have been around the same age and around, or not, maybe not the same age, but around living together a little bit when he was spending time at Mount Vernon.
Yeah. Well, so when his son George was sent to America and to stay with the Washingtons first in Philadelphia, and then when Washington leaves the presidency, he goes and stays with them at Mount Vernon. He knows Nellie and Wash Custis very well. They're the 2 youngest, and they were the ones who were raised with their grandparents full time at Mount Vernon. The 2 oldest were with their mother and would spend time with their grandparents, but Nellie and Wash spent most of the time there. So he was particularly close with the two of them. And so he does George Washington Lafayette spends more time at Woodlawn than his father does. He and Nellie were very close in age, and there's a couple like letters of like he left Fredericksburg early to go see her, and he escorts her to an event at the White House, and so it's like a nice like reunion of like the next generation as well, which is very sweet.
I also loved that he ran into Philip Lee. So if you could
Yes.
explain who that is, because he's actually very but well known, at least to Isaac and I thought it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, Philip Lee, who is the son of Frank Lee and the nephew of William Lee, and if those names sound familiar to you, they're one of some of the enslaved men that we know the most about at Mount Vernon. And so Philip Lee, because slavery was matrilineal and his mother was enslaved through the Custis Dower division, slavery at Mount Vernon gets a little complicated. There are kind of two sets of people who are enslaved. They're the people who Washington enslaves, and then there are the people that are enslaved through Martha's husband's Dower estate, which Washington has no legal ability to free. So when Washington dies and he puts into his will that those that he enslaves will be free upon Martha's death, which she then frees early, many of these two different family lines have kind of intermarried and had relationships with each other throughout the years. So it creates this kind of complication of things. The people who are through the Custis Dower estate are then split up through the Custis grandchildren, which is how Philip Lee ends up at Arlington House, and which is Wash Custis's home. It's one of his first days in Washington. Lafayette is invited out to see Arlington House. He's had like a really full schedule. I think if it's not like the first day that he was there, it's the second day, but like he's been traveling all over. He's exhausted. He still comes, and they've prepared like this huge meal, and it's very apparent that Lafayette is kind of just really worn out at this point.
Yeah.
But Philip Lee, who is an enslaved valet at Arlington House, comes into the room, and Lafayette immediately lights up. He asks about his family. He asks about how he's doing. And the reason we know about this is not through Philip Lee's words. It's through Wash Custis, who writes about it later. He publishes kind of like a column of like my adventures with Lafayette. But it's indicating that like Lafayette's recognition of Philip Lee as something that Wash is proud of having this connection, which is very interesting because we usually don't see that type of dynamic. This is also not the only time that Lafayette does something like this. He does this multiple times throughout the tour. One of the most famous instances of it happens when he's reunited with a man named James Armistead, who was an enslaved man who volunteered to work as a spy during the siege of Yorktown. And he worked as a double agent to the benefit of the Americans. He would assume the role of like a runaway slave or a courier. And because he was a black man, people really weren't paying attention to him. So he was able to kind of move across these army lines undetected. He gets information from the British, and he feeds that information back to Lafayette, who's then able to know that there's kind of an approaching British reinforcements, and he's able to send the French fleet to seal off the Chesapeake Bay, which is ultimately going to win the siege of Yorktown. After the war is over, James petitions for his freedom. In Virginia, there's this act, the Act of 1783, that all enlisted men would be freed, but because James's work was through espionage, it wasn't through combat, he wasn't eligible. But Lafayette hears about this when he comes back in 1784, and he personally petitions the Virginia Assembly, saying that James has done invaluable services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. It's been reproduced and was reproduced again during Lafayette's tour. Because of their reunion. And then in 1787, James was awarded his emancipation. And after that, he chooses a new name. He goes by James Armistead Lafayette, or James Armistead Fayette. So they're reunited in Virginia, where Lafayette sees him in the crowd. He calls out his name, and the two men embrace publicly. And what's really interesting is that Lafayette is kind of consciously doing these things in the South, in public, in front of majority white crowds. He understands that there is a social protocol. He also understands that as the nation's guest, nobody's going to tell him not to do something. So he's using it in a very subtle way of subverting social norms and trying to like, what I see it as trying to normalize behavior, and without outright like standing at a lectern and saying like what you're doing is wrong, which he absolutely believed that it was wrong. He had held staunch anti-slavery views throughout his life. But he is kind of using this opportunity, and not that I don't think ever really even intended to do this. Like he wasn't like, I'm going to come to America and I'm going to teach these Americans a thing or two about the institution of slavery. I think it was something that was very natural to him. He was really unafraid to look for a solution and fix things right away, which when then you compare him to people like Jefferson, who's like, oh, this is the next generation's problem to deal with. I think that's why Lafayette stands so much in contrast with him, because he's saying, no, we can do something right now. He does this with Washington back in the 1780s, writes a letter to Washington about like, I have this great plan of how we can eradicate slavery. And it's he purchases plantations in French Guiana, and with the intention of eradicating slavery, where people are paid for their wages, there's no corporal punishment, people are educated. Unfortunately, this does not come to fruition because of the French Revolution, when all of his property is seized. There's no like really clear end to this. But Washington writes back after Lafayette says like, here's my great plan, and basically says like, I'll tell you more when I see you, which is such a Washington way of not wanting to put his kind of true thoughts onto paper. But Lafayette wasn't, and it shows that this is not like kind of a youthful thing that he had. He continued it throughout his life. Even one more instance of during the tour is he's at Monticello with Thomas Jefferson, and the two of them are taking a carriage ride down to the University of Virginia, and Lafayette spends the majority of this carriage ride really pestering Jefferson about like, hey, you wrote this amazing document, and yet you hold people in bondage. Don't you think that's a little hypocritical? And the reason we know that this happened is because the man who was driving the carriage was an enslaved man named Israel Jefferson, and he was interviewed about 40 years later in a series called Life Among the Lowly, and he said that he remembered this for the rest of his life, and he had never seen someone speak to Jefferson in the way that Lafayette did. And they were still good friends throughout having these very much morally opposing viewpoints. So yeah, I think it's just one thing that makes him very unique when you think about the men and people of this era.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. I know historians don't like to engage in counterfactuals, but just interesting to wonder what would have happened had he not left the United States and stay. You know, the consequences of going to France. He participates in that, you know, in the revolution. In that he ends up losing all of his land and not being able to have an impact or like politically in the same way. But a guy with those convictions who had that kind of cachet in the United States at the time, there weren't that many. So interesting to think about what could have happened had he stuck around.
I think about that often. I know, like, as historians, we're not supposed to think about like what could have, but it's human nature, I think, to think about those things. And I do wonder, and then it makes you think about like even things in your own life. It's like I'm totally comfortable thinking about like, oh, if Lafayette stayed, like maybe the Civil War like wouldn't have happened. And then it's like, well, if I make a different decision, what are the consequences or the benefits of that? So
sliding
we
doors.
might not even be here.
It's all that. What's that movie? Yeah. Right. Whether you get on the subway or not. You have blonde hair or brown hair, I think, in that movie. I forget. It's been a long time since I've seen that movie. But so we're coming to the end of the hour, but there's some other things that we are curious. I wanted to get to your opinion on. One of them being Portrayals of Lafayette. Do you have a favorite? There's been one recently in the last year or so.
Yeah.
But he pops up in movies and a play occasionally. So
I always can tell when Lafayette has made an appearance in any sort of medium, because I get so many text messages from people. They're like, your guy. I loved the portrayal of him in the Franklin miniseries. I thought that
was my favorite.
It was
was my favorite.
So good. I think it captured this like teenage, like pomposity and like kind of arrogance, but also just like awkwardness. And
he's like skinny and gangly and awkward,
yes!
and like
So young.
it was very
Yes!
and
young and innocent.
So I love that's been my favorite.
It's the only reason I remember his first name, because what's his name? The grandson is constantly Gilbert. Gilbert.
It was I loved it. I'm definitely someone when it comes to like historical like depictions of things, I can absolutely take off like my like professional hat and really just enjoy it for like what it is. I loved him in that. I've heard that he has made an appearance in the new season of the Marie Antoinette show on PBS, which is produced by Canal Plus, like French
it's a
PBS.
French show,
Yeah. So I've heard he's made an appearance in that. I have not been able to watch it yet, so I'm looking forward to having an opinion on that. But I'm also hoping that he maybe gets his own miniseries one day, because his life is just begging for it, I think.
Well, and I think you should be a part of writing it, because even when you started out, he goes for revenge. He may or may not have dressed up like a lady. Oh, he didn't, but he could have. You know, it's like the, revenge on France. And then he comes and saves the...
I had actually never... that you're the first person to mention the Cornwallis connection to his father. And it's an interesting thing to think about, and one that I could see him, someone who lost their dad, have like this mythological idea of like,
especially like in that time period, and when it's so young, and when family and like you're inheriting titles, and like there's it's so like
legacy and all that kind of stuff is so important. That's He's definitely an interesting character that's worth, if anyone is from a studio listening to this, listen, it's worth greenlighting.
I think
definitely.
So. And I think the fact that he still remains this really universally beloved figure that people feel so drawn to. And I do think one of the reasons for that is I think people feel there's maybe feel like an absence of someone like him in our society today. I think like that was something that was so striking to me when I was doing this research, is like, I don't even think someone like him could exist in the society that we have today. So what I ask people when I speak at groups and have programs is I encourage them. I'm like, if you are inspired by him, if you feel like this is someone you want to emulate in some sort of way, or you were like, wow, what amazing things that he did, then it's your responsibility to be the person that continues his work. Because there is no Lafayette that's like coming to save us, so to speak. It's a responsibility that all of us share. And I think that's something that I take away from studying figures in history, is that there can be small actions. We don't have to be doing something that's going to have books written about us, maybe necessarily per se, but we can be a Lafayette of our community and the world immediately around us.
Listen, all it takes is one enterprising PhD candidate to stumble across your text messages 150 years from now, for them to write a book all about you and your impacts.
And all of a sudden you're famous.
And
that's
all of a sudden
true.
There is a history book written about you.
So with all the research you've done on his trip, on his visit, do you have a favorite story, whether it be favorite because it's funny or poignant or whatever you choose?
Ooh, I do have one, but now I'm gonna have to think about it. Give me like, usually like I would think that I would have this like completely.
Well, you probably have so many of them rolling around.
Note to
in
editor,
your head.
put the Jeopardy music over this section.
That is exactly what I was thinking. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's good. Oh man, I'm trying to think of like a specific one right now.
I was gonna sing it, but I'm not gonna. Like that was my first thing I was gonna.
They're like, I'll just tell the editor to do it.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I don't know if this is a favorite, but this is something that really spoke to me when I found this out. So I grew up in a very, very small town in Western Howard County, Maryland. No one's ever heard of where I'm from, except for the fact it's on the National Road. And Lafayette passed through my town on his way from Baltimore to Frederick. He went to visit Frederick right before New Year's in 1824. And the city had they erected like an arch for him, and they had like a welcome, and he had like a meal in my town. And now there's a like a Lafayette like plaque, like commemorating on like the Lafayette Trail that marks his thing. So I think it's one of those like personal things that like people, even though I wasn't there 200 years ago, but like my town was, and it played a part in this larger collective moment, which I think is why people like feel connected to this, because so many big moments in history, it's only happened at one place in one time, but this happened across all 24 states. So it's an opportunity for everyone to participate if you live in one of those 24 states, and for like local history to shine too, which is something I'm very passionate about.
So one of those places that you were talking about at the beginning, where you said this is the biggest thing that's ever happened, it was where you're from.
Yeah, that and when we got the Dunkin' Donuts, those two things.
And if I may, I live in Virginia, in Charlottesville, outside of Charlottesville, and he visited a house. Sorry, he visited a house that is a few hundred yards from my house, and the street I live on, he passed through. So I have that same feeling you do of, he could have been standing in my yard for all I know, because
Right.
I can see the house from my yard and say that's the house he visited. So yeah, that personal connection.
That's really cool.
That's neat. Yeah. Well, if I think that's a great, like, nice place to land this conversation. And for for anyone who's interested in the tour, go look up. There's still some stuff happening. We're not at the end of the tour like celebration yet,
Right.
are we?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Well, not until September, and he will be ending in Washington D.C. and heading back to France in September. So there's definitely plenty time to get involved.
Yeah.
So go take a Google. Go find out what's happening locally. See what dirt road Lafayette may have walked across and kicked a rock down 200 years ago. That's near you.
Yeah.
And please check out the book. It is called Marquis de Lafayette Returns, a tour of America's national capital region. Is there a place where you prefer people order this from?
I always support people. You can get it through bookshop.org, which supports your local independent bookstore, which is a place that I always suggest people to buy their books from. So, but anywhere is fine. It's anywhere books are sold, you can get it.
I love a bookstop.org plug.
Yes, and we will have a link in the show notes. If you don't want to Google it, just scan down, and there you go.
And so, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us. This was awesome. I love talking about Lafayette.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I love talking about him. So the pleasure is mine.